gonna start with like a nerdy theory question, but to do
Okay.
something a bit interesting, obviously, as leftists, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
we're interested in emancipation, right? Whatever that means,
Yeah.
that's kind of the
Yeah.
interested in. And
Yeah.
certainly, yeah, in fact, I think it's in the section where you talk on political film, and
Okay.
you write on this film, 2 Days, One Night, and this idea of
Mm.
like how does one become a political subject?
Mm.
And something that's kind of been on the news recently is the United Helping
Luigi.
Luigi. You know it, yeah.
Yeah,
So I mean,
I knew it.
and like I've been thinking a lot about like,
Yeah.
of course, right? I mean, Benjamin recently on the Wild Left podcast, he was like, "Oh, look, this is just spectacle. There really isn't. This isn't really an event in the Badooian sense." And
Yeah.
perhaps he's right because like. Yeah, I was reading this thing on Badu. Like, Badu never thought that 9/11, for instance, was an event. For him, that wasn't an
Yeah.
event. Like, there wasn't
Yeah.
a shift in the symbolic order. There wasn't something new that came out of it.
Mhm.
But then at the same time, you kind of write a lot in the book on this notion that a part of what cinema does is seeing, yes, your lack, one's
Mhm.
ontological lack, but also the contradiction of society, of reality as such.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting about Luigi, and maybe I'm completely misanalyzing this here, is that there is some kind of contradiction where he's like this tech bro, he doesn't seem like a political person at all. He's not like a leftist radical, or he's just like a
Mhm.
tech guy who comes from a really rich family who took the anger and directed it towards, well, in my opinion, the right symbolic figure, which
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
insurance company, I mean, the devil incarnate. But so in this notion of like becoming a political
Yeah.
subject, this isn't really a question, but more like, yeah, how are you what's your vibe on the whole Luigi situation?
Luigi.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
know, it's funny, I was just at a birthday party and discussing this very thing because the girl whose birthday it was really fancies Luigi, And it's interesting because in terms of like the mediatized moment, he is very conventionally handsome. What do you call it?
Good looking bloke, yeah.
There's a term for it with it. Regulation hottie, maybe is what you
Oh,
would call
I don't
him.
know
Like
what that is. You're more than I am. I have got no idea what that means.
I've heard this term regulation hottie. I've heard it mean different things, but apparently it means just like standard issue, like not, maybe Johnny Depp or something, but he's definitely like
Decent looking.
um
Yeah, yeah.
he's a good looking guy. But also in terms of the spectacle, the other thing that was, really amazing, and you referenced 9/11, and I sometimes think this is probably quite a crazy thing to say, but in terms of like as an art piece or as an art project, you'd really it's quite an impressive visual event. And just that footage of Luigi, I mean, I don't know if he knew, it obviously seemed very well planned. And I think people were quite shocked when it came out, who he was, and he was just found in this McDonald's. And the people, there was all this sort of doubt online, that's not really him, because it seemed like, he was not only just this Robin Hood figure, but like actually a sort of like sniper, because the way he did, carry out the killing was quite. I just been watching this show, The Jackal, that's been on in the UK. I don't know if it's been on in America, but it's sorry, in Australia, but it's a very compelling, media product. And obviously, I think he had planned to have his Monopoly money in this backpack. So there's all these sorts of different reasons why it's so captivating. And I can imagine that Benjamin's probably a bit skeptical about it. I mean, in some ways, you could say, you would hope that this isn't something where we can enjoy at arm's length a sort of performance of emancipation that is sort of a release valve where we feel like something's being done. But
Like
but I
catharsis.
think
Yeah.
a catharsis. But I think something that I find kind of interesting, and this is where I see political emancipation taking place, potentially quite at odds with what has been the received wisdom about what a left-wing politics is. And I think it's to do with a material structure of our society that's very much to do with this moment in time. You know, in the last sort of 10 years or so, there's been a real sort of reflex to call people Nazis or crypto-fascists or crypto-communists or whatever, whoever you disagree with. And of course, you know, Nazism is a movement, a right-wing fascist movement that emerged in Middle Europe in the 1930s, a very specific time. And this appeal to casting out people who you disagree with certain epithets where it's beyond the pale and it can't be even tarried with as a symptom, you know, even if, let's say, someone's politics aren't good, but there's something to be assessed there, that speaks to an aspect of our utopic capitalist logic where instead of tarrying with the contradictions politically and thinking universally, we have to create and erect absolute monsters or sort of scapegoats behind whom we can imagine there is a reality where capitalism functions, and this reality is contingently bad, and the absolute enemy that we can cast out with certain epithets, like, so for the right, they might say crypto-communist, and you hear these words like neo-Marxist, which is hilarious because often what is claimed to be a neo-Marxist position is actually, I would say, a highly capitalist position, often like, let's say, the left wing of capital, but nothing to do with Marx at all. But this sort of logic is actually part of the capitalist bad infinity. Interestingly, so I think what has happened, and one of the ways in which capitalism devolves, as Marx points out in Capital, is that the rate of profit tends to decline. So the rate of profit tends to decline because of automation, he says, because in capitalism, profit is really generated from labor value. So the amount of work that's put into, so work essentially. When you have a collapsing rate of profit, and if you look this up online, it's kind of crazy because obviously we have huge inequality and what seems like, and it is true, like rampant capitalism. This is sort of a weird contradiction in capitalism that I think needs to be sort of explicated more clearly. You look at sort of graphs and like the global rate of profit is like 0. And so you think like, well, how is this working? How is it still going on? But Marx points out that there are things called countervailing tendencies, where capitalism, when the rate of profit falls so low, finds different ways to extract value and keep the profit going. And often today, this is the thing that's really sad because I see, you know, and I could be wrong, that, you know, let's say Marx is right, and the next stage of after capitalism and social order is socialism, that perhaps socialism, and we've had aspects of socialism already, are the moments when we are able to organize society to redistribute a surplus value. And that might head towards a communal ownership of the means of production, something like communism. So we sort of suppose, and really to allow society to function at a certain point because of this rate of profit and the conundrums that result from it, governments need to do socialism. But what they have ended up doing, especially, and I think 2008 is a real sign of this, but this was actually only possible because it was perhaps a trend that was already occurring, but it's happening absolutely crazily now. And the UK is so guilty of this, is a state-sponsored corporate socialism. So it looks like socialism, it looks like redistribution, but in fact, it's a bailout economy where workers' money is being used as the very thing to maintain the profits of the corporations. There are other countervailing tendencies. So you have a tendency towards monopolies. So it's impossible for all corporations to have to get the value. So you see this in tech, you have this race towards being the monopolistic entity, like with Uber, and actually this introduction of illegal business practices that were sort of outlawed under Theodore Roosevelt with like the antitrust laws and stuff. But you also have this exploitation of young people in a society that can't offer roles with something that people have called it different things, but basically the commoditization of education, taking people out of the workforce because there aren't enough jobs for them for several years, allowing people to buy into the logic of exception, which
Yeah.
is precisely the ideology of capitalism, backing ourselves, going to university, paying tens of thousands of pounds or dollars for that education. But and in the UK especially, we had these policies under New Labour, and the this well-known, he's just passed away, John Prescott, the education secretary, had a northern accent, and he would say education, education, education. So this was the notion that you could actually just maintain capitalism, and instead of dealing with the economic circumstances that eventually impoverished the many for the few, part of the one of the countervailing tendencies of the global rate, the rate of profit declining, is monopoly logic. You have you have to find all these different ways to sort of like pretend to try to put out the fire in the long term, which is sort of by capitalism's continuation. But capitalism is always impoverishing the many for the few. So instead of rethinking the economy to work out like, okay, why don't we have enough jobs for people? You think, oh, you can just get there by educating people. But of course, any promise can be commoditized. And unless you're transforming the material conditions, you're just perpetuating the system. And you see this with all sorts of apparently emancipatory logics that are taken on by the market that allow us to believe we are heading towards socialism when in fact we are having a greater, the culture wars themselves are a highly commoditizable series of events that take place. Huge amounts of labor takes place, unpaid and unrecognized through, online activities, through affect culture, things like this. But we have basically, and this is something that we have seen very many times throughout history, lots of people who have distinguished themselves at great personal cost and great personal sacrifice through education. It could have been all sorts of different, and I'm very, very pro-education. I really like philosophy. The issue is this sort of commoditized education and using education as a means to mystify and perpetuate exploitation of the many. So you have a thrust towards this perfectionistic, goal orientated, apparently you can distinguish yourself through the accumulation of degrees, commodity logic. And this also commodity logic, this logic of exception, has infiltrated the neoliberal university. And there's a question as to how this has affected the kind of things we learn about today. And also this utilitarian attempt to utilitarianize the university towards like being employable. But of course, as we all know, the more people who have degrees, the less value they have. So we have this moment where, in fact, in the UK, there was a recent study just done where the average graduate earns less now than the average non-graduate and has huge amounts of debt. Benjamin Studebaker was talking the other day at a talk I was at about how the average graduate, okay, we have, of course, the exception. So we have a difference between rump professionals, he calls them, people who have done the degrees and are now the managers of capital, and it's worked out for them. I mean, has it obviously alienated in weird ways through that kind of work, and it would be really depressing, I think. But then you have this lumpenized mass of surplus graduates. And this is a real tragedy. And when in history you've had moments where this kind, and not just in capitalism, but in a sort of surplus of, people, one thing I really disagree with in the culture wars is calling people who've gone to university elites. Because in fact, it actually buys into the logic of capitalism, where there is a distinction between lumpenized professionals and lumpenized, everybody else. Because in reality, and I think this is what emancipation is politically, is to recognize our universal position relative to the lack in subjectivity and relative to capital.
Correct.
So one of the things that I think is interesting, and that there's a potential with Luigi, is that if you go on any sort of Reddit forum, what is really surprising is universally, people are recognizing something in this moment. So, I don't know if you saw this meme, but, immediately Ben Shapiro was saying, how awful Luigi's thing is. And his followers are like, fuck you, Ben, actually, da 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 da. So whether you agree with the tactics of this man or not, there is something where people from, it's difficult to, I don't think the words left and right culturally actually philosophically hold water. So, but across the cultural spectrum, people with different political positions are recognizing something together. And I think that's an emancipatory moment. But where I think something reactionary and difficult can occur is often in movements. And some could argue that the Luigi killing, right? So Luigi is um, it's an interesting position because, by the way, one thing that I think really speaks to a truth about politics is people have written sort of think pieces about how this guy's politics were so confused, but it's actually the average person doesn't fit neatly in some, A equals A equals A equals A, this, then this, and this, and this. We think in complex and contradictory ways. We all have a mix of weird experiences in our lives where we might believe some things about this issue and some things about this. Our personal experience about poverty in this way makes us believe that. There's all sorts of different ways where we are sort of in a total sort of cloud of mystery in terms of politics. And I think this attempt to tribalize and turn into silos the political is precisely the logic of capital. But historically, often it is the surplus offspring of aristocrats that can cause openings, political openings, but often that turn reactionary. And the reason I say that is because one thing that's really traumatic for people, especially if you think of the average graduate, and I see this so much in the arts that I work in. My husband's an academic. You see this as so many people have PhDs and there just are not the roles. And it's absolutely tragic. It's the lack of human care to have created this sort of system where, again, there's contingent factors like millennials and younger being the offspring of the richest generation in history. What's next? The promise of exception, a child who has a job, or not even a job, a role beyond the constraints of capital. And this is what we all sort of hope for. But there just aren't those positions, not least because how can everybody be Martin Scorsese, but also because the economy has collapsed. There's one statistic I saw. It's difficult to comment on statistics because you see all these different things and they're like a snapshot of one aspect. But somewhere I saw a statistic, something like that in terms of the collapse, the rapidity of the collapse in economic prospects from the boomer generation to the millennial. I don't know if it was looking at one country in particular, has not been seen since the Black Death. So this is insane. But what can happen is, and I think I mentioned this in the book, in terms of the logic of exception, fantasy, the more precarious we are, the more anguish we experience, the more we invest in fantasy. And fantasy is what makes life worth living. I sometimes see some kind of more, let's say, nihilistic philosophers who are like, it's all shit, life's all shit, it's lack, it's shit. But actually, lack in reality is what makes life worth living because it engenders desire. And desire and fantasy are like the lifeblood of subjectivity, and it makes life worth living. But of course, there is such thing as the reality principle, and we have to be able to tarry with it. But often we are able to tarry with the reality principle at moments when we feel more secure. But when we have an investment in fantasy or a lot of investment in exception, and our entire subjectivity is tied up in this logic of being the exception. My husband and I actually wrote we haven't done anything with it, but a sort of dark comedy, very sympathetic to the main character movie that one day, who knows, we might be able to make, called The Glass Graduate, based on a Cervantes short story. And Cervantes was writing sort of like 16th century or something like that, maybe, yeah. 1500s, potentially 1600s in Spain. So, this is an era that was completely different, but it's really interesting reading this short story about this. Basically, a guy who goes to university and starts to believe he's made out of glass. But if your whole childhood has been operationalized towards a promise of the logic of exception, and you've worked really hard and you've paid for it, to give up on that image of yourself, one would rather die often. And you've seen, if you look at Benjamin Studebaker had a really good analysis of the 2019 election in the UK in terms of Jeremy Corbyn and other moments where we had these sort of socialistic, interesting moments. But how it was precisely often in a class, a non-emancipatory desire to not recognize oneself as a universal proletarianized subject.
Mm.
because it's too painful. And often you have a casting of people you don't agree with. And this happens in many different ways. You often have people who maybe aren't of that position thinking, and I don't want to predict into people's minds, but what kind of crazy cultural nonsense do these people who went to university believe in? And on the other hand, I've heard people, many of my contemporaries who go to university, who call normal working people who maybe haven't had the same life experiences as them, and not because they're terrible people, just don't have those experiences and those tastes and what have you, and are called often by those who don't want to acknowledge actually the shared material position as things like mouth breathers. In Britain, we use the term gammon, which is, I think, quite an offensive kind of term, when in reality, we are all, and increasingly so, subjects of capital.
Mm.
Who, and one of the statistics that Ben was talking about last week was the average graduate, not including the rump professionals who've managed to secure a place in a professional managerial class, earns the equivalent of what a labourer or a sort of a working class person, for instance, in the 1970s would have earned. But in the 1970s, you had a more socialized economy. Sometimes, obviously, there were fewer scientific advancements in different ways, but you had, a better funded, let's say, National Health Service. It was easier to get a house, and if you were in a normal heterosexual relationship, you could have a number of children, and your wife didn't have to work. Now we have two graduates, let's say the standard couple, who have spent a lot of money on student debt. They have been out of the workforce for many years, and now they can expect to have a similar salary to a labourer in the 1970s, but they both have to work. And those socialized services are increasingly getting underfunded and privatized, or are because of capital mobility as well. So the extremely rich find ways to mitigate against the collapsing rate of profit by moving their money around, not paying tax. The thing that's actually crazy is you think, oh, the global rate of profit being zero means rich people don't have money. It's actually a motivation to actually find more and more and more ways to keep the money, and you actually get a monopolistic system. So this is how, the contradiction itself generates more
Or
contradiction.
contradiction, yeah.
So then you have the living standard and what people can, and you see it all sorts of different ways. People, and maybe it'll get to a point, and I do think, I mean, there's different aspects in terms of where you can read things in Marx, that like being a worker puts you in a position where not only are you aware of the excesses of capital, but you're able to enact collective bargaining if you have control on supply chains. But obviously, in the way that our economy works now, that's difficult because we're not in sort of productive roles in a sort of material sense where we're working at a factory or something like that. But there is sort of this hope that people will come to recognize their shared material interests, but the subjective destitution, it's much easier to scapegoat and to say, oh, it's the reason for my poverty is, let's say, an immigrant or something, or the reason for my poverty is this group of people who don't agree with me, and if only they stop voting this way, then. And the thing is, as Zizek points out, I think quite brilliantly, you can be a hypochondriac and have cancer. You can be toxically jealous of your partner and they're still cheating. So
Mm.
you look at someone like Trump, and so you could say people have voted for Trump and it's a symptom of something. But in many ways, Trump is as bad as people fear him to be. I mean, you look at, obviously there was this video that was put out by Trump and his team after the election. It's all about togetherness and unity and stuff. But I mean, again, capitalism really loves to use false universals to promise, because as an ideological foil for the fact that it's the most individualistic, exploitative, exclusionary, subjugatory logic. And then often what people do, which is really difficult, is they'll critique the ideological foil. So they'll critique the false universal and then return to more individualism. And you see this with sort of identity politics in all sorts of different ways. When in reality, we want more of the universal, not the false universal, because the
Mm.
universal, actually, if we're thinking about how lack is the underpinning of, potentially from this sort of perspective, the universe subjectivity, and is in reality as much as capitalism tries to deny that fact. So the trouble is and something that I think is really shocking is when we actually see the sort of the people that Trump's appointed. So like the richest
Oh
man
yeah.
in history. I mean, this is absolutely fucking crazy, right?
I mean, it's ridiculous. So-called populist precedent. Yeah, and like all neocons, people that were part of the military industrial complex. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's to a point where I mean, that's the irony here. It's like it is absurd and bizarre. I forget where I read this, Helen. I'm sure you've come across it. It's a famous quote where the author goes, now we go to art for reality because reality itself is full of fictions. As in,
Yeah.
it's like in they call it postmodern modernity. As Frederick Jameson, capitalism is the postmodern logic, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Reality itself is full of fictions that we go to art for something real. So and then you
Yeah.
Trump's appointments. It's ridiculous. And then here's where again I come back to this notion of